Jeff, you're not a writer, are you?
Yes, I am.
You are a writer, okay. Then that's perfect. I did see Jeff's name down on this participant, so I wanted everyone to say a little bit about their sort of background in terms of science and their sort of own area of specialisation, but also how scientifically rigorous they consider their own fiction to be. So perhaps if we start with Charlie at the end.
Well, I'm actually the fraud on this panel. My most advanced physics qualification is an A-level. Having said that, I did a degree in pharmacy which requires a passing familiarity with chemistry, biochemistry, and a bunch of other science subjects.
Still science, isn't it?
Yeah, and then I did to compound the error, I did a cargo conversion degree in computer science. I tend to work by having the Bluffer's Guide to Astrophysics, namely a friend who's a professor of astrophysics at Imperial, to help out.
Who was it?
Dave Clements.
Oh yeah, Dave. And Charlie, when you're writing your fiction, do you consider yourself to be, writing very rigorous, scientifically, scrupulously accurate fiction, or are you a little bit?
It depends, but I usually find not being rigorous bugs me immensely. So I don't do far too much digging and try to at least be internally consistent. If I'm picking something not obviously possible, something possibly impossible as a premise, such as a time machine or faster than light travel, I at least like to have a grasp on why it is generally considered to be impossible and to try and work out ground rules that apply it consistently.
Thank you. Jeff?
Okay. My background in science, I studied a combination of physics and zoology and ended up as a kind of biophysicist. My career took various twists and turns. So for a while I was a librarian, which is very fortunate because as someone pointed out to me, as a librarian you in fact are one of the attributes of God, omniscience. I thought that's okay. I do write some science fiction stories. I think what I try to do is I make the stories as scientifically rigorous as the story demands. I would agree with Charles. I like making things rigorous because it bugs me when they aren't. So for example, a few years ago I wrote a zombie story, and zombies, I think, are one of the dumbest ideas in fantasy. And so what I decided to do was write a zombie story in which you, if you read it carefully and connect the dots, there is a glimpse of a completely fictional cosmology which explains, if you could connect the dots and actually think about what it all means, explains how the zombies work. It's not a socially rigorous version, it's not scientifically rigorous in a sense, but it's constructed as if it was scientifically rigorous. So it has its own internal logic as to what it should be. I think one of the questions that has to be asked of panellists is, what science have you got wrong? Well, I actually managed to get, in an unpublished story, the Newton's first law of motion wrong, and my writing group spotted it instantaneously and jumped all over me. I used to be 6'6", and you see that.
Yeah, I think we'll get everyone to confess any particularly egregious scientific errors. I've certainly committed a few in my time. Gregory.
Well, I'm Gregory Binford, and I'm actually a practicing scientist. Just published 2 papers in astrobiology last month. I'm a professor of physics at the University of California at Irvine, and I've always tried to write novels which are not so much about getting all the science right, though I try to do that. And my most egregious errors have probably been in biology, but early on decided that the thing that was best to do in fiction, and which few did, was present the way that scientists actually interact with each other and the world and how they think. And the science fiction was ideal in a way for portraying scientists, because what scientists try to do is advance the unknown. I mean, they want to work at the perimeter of the known and carry it forward. And often this is tiny incremental work, you know, what's the next digit in this property of boron, for example. Actually, that's horrible, but whatever scientists would like to do is discover something really big that opens up the universe. And the reason is not just that I'm going to win a Nobel Prize, but there is some of that, though. But rather, we really want to understand the world. And the kind of sudden revelation that opens up your universe is, of course, the sense of wonder, which is what science fiction is about. So science fiction is, in its heart, about the experience the scientists seek, or at least it always seemed that way to me. Moments, say, in culture as a whole, when in the middle of the 1990s, suddenly, from the supernova data, we realized that the expansion of the universe is accelerating at big time. That was, I remember, just a plain old shock. I thought confidently, well, in another couple of years there'll be 5 competing theories about what the dark energy is, and there'll be a nice big fight, just like the fight between the steady state and the Big Bang Theory. Actually, it has not happened.
It was one of those, I forget who it was, but who was that particle physicist who said, who ordered that? You know, that?
Yeah, it was Gell-Mann or Robbie, one of those guys said, it was actually a joke referring to their habit at Columbia University in the 1940s and 50s, where the particle physicists always go to Chinese restaurants and kind of a competition to order the most obscure dishes, you know, the flambe of snail or something. And the remark was, who ordered that? Well, to say that about a result in particle physics or in astrophysics is an inverse compliment. And so my fiction has tried to get out what I honestly experienced through my career as a physicist, all the way from graduate school in the 1960s, through Cambridge, University of California, the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory, where I did my first postdoc. I was hired by Edward Teller, and to embody that in fiction, but in science fiction.
You're probably still one of the few SF writers who really does get the process of science. I mean, not just in Timescape, which everyone is familiar, but in your more recent novels, you give a good impression of what science is actually like at the cold face.
No, that's my intention.
It's not generally done in science fiction.
No, and one of the reasons is that science fiction writers, even when they know science, like Isaac Asimov, he left academia fairly early when they pressured him to do more research and get grants. And I've been through that process. I've weathered that. I've got lots of grants, ran an experimental laboratory for 25 years, did all that, and I just mirrored it in the fiction. And I had a discussion with Isaac once about this, and he said, you know, if I'd stayed at Boston University, I could have written the kind of things you've written. He was talking about Timescape, a novel of mine, and I said, yeah, but you would have written less. And he said, yeah, but I wanted to write more, so I'm glad I did it anyway. And he sure did like to write.
Well, unless anyone has anything you want to follow?
Yeah.
You have a name yourself? Oh, hand up yourself.
I'd like to follow on.
Go ahead.
Sense of wonder is an important ingredient of SF, and particularly of hard SF. But there's another ingredient that we ignore at our peril, and that is that the act of reading science fiction, taking it literally, a story in which a spaceship is not a metaphor, it's a spaceship, requires what critics have been calling for quite a long time, the willing suspension of disbelief of the reader. We're reading an intricately constructed universe that has stuff in it that is not literally true. Therefore, we have to, well, as writers, it's our job to somehow cozen or seduce the reader into suspending their disbelief in the 7 flavors of impossibility before breakfast. One of the easiest ways to blow willing suspension of disbelief completely is to get something glaringly wrong. And that's part of the reason why some degree of rigor, or at least plausibility, is needed. I'm reminded of a space opera I read many, many years ago, which features Napoleonics in space and spaceships rotating around their axis to provide a centrifugal simulate equivalent of gravity. And you know what? They got it slightly wrong. They were in 0G at the rim and 4G at the hub. They would be withheld to
Doesn't work like that, right?
Yeah, they can publish.
That would be a really interesting cosmology if it did work like that. But probably not one amenable to our kind of life.
Actually, there are a couple of science fiction stories where centrifuges are used to generate artificial gravity, and the authors have called it centripetal gravity. In your case, that would actually be truly centripetal gravity.
Yeah.
But what they should be saying is centrifugal gravity, and yes, it would be weighty on the outside of the rim, and you'd be weightless on the inside. I must admit, the first time I saw a story by an author I do know, who deserves to be beaten around the head, so not only did his first volume of the trilogy referring to centripetal gravity, chuckled, oh, that's a cool way of doing artificial gravity. Then I realised, oh, it's meant to be rotating, so it's not. In the last volume, he actually refers to, yes, centripetal gravity, later on he calls it centrifugal gravity. I should be merciless.
Well, I'll just say a couple of words about myself, and then I'm going to throw another sort of question out to the panel. Well, I was, I'm Al Reynolds, I was a scientist for nearly 20 years at the European Space Agency, worked on a number of different areas. And sort of in parallel with that, I suppose I established myself as a science fiction writer. And I think that very early on, because I was, my publisher said, well, what do you do for a living? I'm a space scientist, I work in the astrophysics department. Oh, you're an astrophysicist. And if you are a scientist, if you work in astronomy, there's a clear distinction between a working astronomer and an astrophysicist. Astrophysicists are very, you need mathematically savvy guys, really into modelling and sort of figuring out the interior structures of stars and nuclear synthesis, that kind of thing. And I was always very clear to my publisher, no, I'm not really an astrophysicist, but you're kind of stuck anyway. But I turned away from doing full-time science about 6 years ago. I suppose you don't really ever switch off the sort of science mindset. But I've always been a little bit uneasy about being labelled an RSF writer, or at least I don't really see myself as operating at the very sort of rigorous end of RSF. So I break too many rules, and I do it consciously and I do it unconsciously. But what I'd like to, just to throw something else at the panel, is it the case that when we set down to write a story, we have some idea of narrative? Is narrative always going to be fundamentally opposed to physics? Is physics going to get in the way of telling a story? Is it the enemy of fun, ultimately? And is that what should triumph? Is it the dictates of narrative or the dictates of science?
That's a good title, The Enemy of Fun. Gosh, I don't think it should be the enemy of fun. I mean,
but you've written some of your novels use sort of FTL to get the, I'm thinking sort of like, what's that early one where all the sort of cargo was slower than light, but the
that's a Steve Baxter novel.
No. Is it Japanese or Chinese dominated future where there's a mix?
Oh, that's Deeper in the Darkness.
Yeah,
you're right. I cheated in that one, but it was. I used to have what did I know? I was a graduate student. No, actually, that was after the graduate student. Actually, I did write that story as a graduate student in first draft, and I got my doctorate, and then tried to swear off bad habits, but. Okay, you got me. That's How far did you go about it? In 1970 with that story?